And maybe the first thing I ought to ask, in line with how our conversation started, is where the great concern for animals first entered into your life and philosophical career.
Yes, that's a good question, because many people assume that if you have that great concern for animals, you're an animal lover. And I'm not an animal lover, and I never was an animal lover. And I don't have a cat sitting on my lap, or a dog. I don't have any companion animals, and I have at times. We have had a cat when the children were small. They wanted to have one, and we have a friend who somehow is a magnet for stray cats, so we took one of them off her hands when she was getting to have too many. We've had cats. We've also had ex-laboratory rats in the house, so I think they're pretty cute companion animals too. But I haven't had any companion animals for many years. So for me, my concern about animals really arose much more from my general concern about suffering and the idea that suffering is a bad thing, and the recognition that we inflict an immense amount of suffering unnecessarily on non-human animals. And I must admit that I was blissfully ignorant of that for the first 24 years of my life. Now, that may seem pretty strange to people nowadays, because how could you not be aware of something like factory farming and suffering that's inflicted on animals when they're raised for food? But I grew up in a different era. In the 1960s, really nobody talked about animals, or at least, the kind of people that I was, right? So, as I mentioned, I was politically active in Australia, which was a strong ally of the United States in Vietnam, sent troops to Vietnam. I was involved in groups protesting against the Vietnam War, protesting particularly against conscription for the Vietnam War. I was concerned with civil liberties. I was involved with an organization advocating reform of the law prohibiting abortion. So I was very involved, but I never thought about animals as a political issue in any way on this level. And my image of animals was, well, this is a thing for animal lovers. There are people who love dogs and cats and they don't want to see them badly treated. Okay, sure. If somebody had said, do you think it's okay to cause suffering to a dog or cat? Of course, I would have said, no, that's bad. But I would never thought this was a big issue. And I continued to eat meat until after I went to Oxford. So this is now 1970. I was going to philosophy classes. I happened after one class to get into a conversation with a Canadian graduate student called Richard Keshen, who I hadn't known, except that he was another member of this relatively small class, and made some comments to discussion, as I had. So we started talking about what had been said in that class, and he said it happened to be lunchtime. Would you like to continue the conversation over lunch? We could go to my college, Balliol College, and continue there. So I said, great, let's do that. We arrive at Balliol College. At that time, there were just two options for lunch. There was the hot dish of the day, and there was a cold salad plate. And the hot dish of the day was spaghetti with a kind of reddish-brown sauce on it. And Richard said, can you tell me whether the sauce has meat, to the person serving food? And she said, yes, it does contain meat. And he took the salad plate, I took the spaghetti. We continued our conversation about the philosophy class. But when we'd finished that, I said to him, so, what's your problem with eating meat? Because, this is 1970. I really had not met anybody who was a vegetarian as far as I can remember. If you did meet a vegetarian, it was probably going to be a Hindu. I knew there's many Hindus were vegetarian. But, he was a Canadian white guy like me. Why is he a vegetarian? Maybe he's a health crank, I thought. Thinks that, it's terrible for your health to eat meat. Anyway, that was my view about people who didn't eat meat for their health at that time. Or maybe he's an absolute pacifist that thinks that all killing is wrong and the killing of animals is wrong. And that would not be a position I shared. But he simply said, I think it's wrong to treat animals the way that they're treated in order to be turned into meat. And I was a bit surprised by that. I said, well, yeah, I know that they're slaughtered, of course, and I've traveled behind trucks of animals on their way to slaughter. That's really bad. I can see that they're suffering there, but that's one day in their life, and the rest of their life seem to be pretty good, aren't they? They're well fed, they're out grazing in the fields or running around. Don't you think it's worth it? On the whole, it's still a good life. And he said, no, you're wrong. More and more animals are being taken indoors and crowded inside, and no attention is paid to their well-being. It's really just a matter of how many animals can you raise, and the more animals you can squeeze into the sheds or cages or whatever they are, the more money you will get. So that's what is happening, and the animals are having really bad lives all the way through. I was a bit skeptical. I said, really? Where do you get that from? And he referred to one book, which I think was the only book that had been published at that time on factory farming. It was a book called Animal Machines by Ruth Harrison. And so I read it, and it was it really, Richard obviously made me think about this, and deserves a lot of the credit. But Ruth Harrison wrote a book which she was really quoting from the farm journals themselves about how to be a successful farmer in Britain at the time, and how that involves putting your animals indoors and crowding them and so on. And so then I started thinking about, well, I haven't really thought about the moral status of animals very much. I've just assumed that we shouldn't be cruel to them, but that otherwise, if we use them in our own interests, that was okay, that we were somehow more important than they are. And now I had to start rethinking that. I went and looked at some of the people who'd written about animals. Kant was one of them. He said that we don't have any duties to animals because they're not autonomous, they're not self-aware. I thought, well, not sure that that's relevant to, if they can suffer. Does the fact that they're not autonomous or self-aware, their suffering doesn't matter? That doesn't seem right. Aristotle said, the universe is kind of teleological, in which the less rational serves the more rational. Well, we've had Darwin since Aristotle, and that didn't seem to be the right explanation of why these animals are existing. Basically, I didn't find much until I came to Jeremy Bentham again. And of course, Bentham was already congenial to me. I was a utilitarian. And there it was, a little footnote in his introduction to the principles of morals and legislation, where he starts referring to human rights. He really wasn't a believer in rights, of course, as the foundations of ethics, as a utilitarian. But he did think that there was a role for what he might call positive rights or legal rights, rights to be created by society. And then he had a little footnote where he says, the French have recently recognized that the color of a man's skin is no reason for denying him rights, right? So he was talking about the French revolutionaries in 1789 when they abolished slavery in the French colonies. Unfortunately, later on, the Bourbon Restoration restored it, but it was abolished by the rest. And he said, but then he made this really extraordinary remark. He said, perhaps one day it will be recognized that, and he used a couple of expressions which refer to having a tail or whether you have fur. He said that these things will also not be recognized as sufficient reason to abandon a sensitive being to the caprice of a tormentor. So he was really saying that, one day we'll recognize that animals have rights too. And he goes on to say, what else could it be that determines this insuperable line, that is the line of saying you have rights or you don't have rights? And he actually, it's really a remarkable footnote. He actually then imagines someone saying, well, it's because we can reason or because we can use language. And he then says, the question is not can we reason or can we talk, but can we suffer? And he says, and if it were about reasoning or talking, then a baby of a day or a month old is no more conversable or reasonable than, I can't remember which animals he refers to, a dog or a pig or something like that. So then we would have to deny them rights. And I think in a way that's kind of the gist of the whole argument, that I would say. There's lots more to be said, but that really made me see that there's something wrong with these other, Kantian or Aristotelian or wherever they come from, social contract justification, for example, you find in Rawls. These are not really adequate explanations for why all humans have rights and have a superior moral status to any non-human.